Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is David Warrick, the Executive Vice President at Overhaul. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Brittany, always a pleasure.
I'm really grateful to get your perspective today on the conflict in the Middle East that we have seen continue to spiral ever since the United States and Israel first launched a joint attack against Iran over the weekend. And I want to talk about the impact we're seeing on global trade because we have seen major disruptions in shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is the waterway where 20% of the world's oil supply and a tremendous amount of its gas travels through. And Iran reportedly on Monday announced that the strait was closed, and if any tankers tried traveling through it, they would be set on fire. And since then, multiple big shipping companies have suspended passage through the strategic maritime corridor. So to start off the conversation, what are your thoughts on this disturbance to such a critical waterway?
I mean, it's always like any disruption in the supply chain it tends to wreak havoc. But this one in particular, we're still very early days here. We're only really 4 or 5 days in, but already we're starting to see major impacts, and the knock-on impacts are going to be greater. And I've spent the last couple of days with a lot of different companies around the world, just not speculating, but trying to understand what is the short, medium, and long-term impacts if this conflict continues for any length of time.
What are those companies thinking? Let's go through short, medium term, and long term impacts because there isn't a specific deadline to the end of this conflict, right? President Trump said this could last 4 to 5 weeks. However, we're ahead of schedule, but there's not much beyond that.
Right. So what we've already seen this week is we've seen a number of different things. So firstly, as you rightfully said, 20% of the world's oil and gas basically come through the Straits of Hormuz. So that automatically puts pressure on all sorts of things, not just the price of fuel from a gas pump perspective and filling your own car, but also then for anything related to global freight. So, everything that we use from trucking to ships to airlines, we're all dependent on that fuel. So any increase or any disturbance in that flow means that there's going to be an immediate knock-on impact to the supply chain. Second of all, what we've seen is, it's a de facto embargo in terms of like a blockade. We've got 176 ships are currently stuck in and around the Persian Gulf. At the same time, the major shipping companies this week, including Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, Maersk, have all come out and said, either we want our ships to shelter in place, meaning find a safe haven in the region, or they're diverting them, in some cases around the Cape of Africa. For transit to Europe, that adds somewhere between 14 and 21 days, and of course increases the cost. Now, also as a result of insurance premiums in a war scenario increasing, there has been already if you like it, a war tax has been brought on as a surcharge, again by a lot of the global shipping companies, and that can be upwards of 50% from a cost increase perspective for goods moving from Southeast Asia through to Europe. So those are the kind of the short term. Now, if you go forward a little bit to the medium term, well, what does all that mean? Well, when you have a lot of ships stuck in one place, if you think about the world's shipping lanes as a continually moving engine, whenever you start to have some of those ships stuck in any one place, it means that they're not able to get to their next port of call. And that means that you're going to start seeing blank sailings. That means other ships have to compensate, or shipping companies will just say, we're not going to be able to make that. So that creates a knock-on effect. And while this is really, impacting the Suez Canal and the Straits of Hormuz, which are probably more Europe and Africa focused, those knock-on impacts to the global shipping business will eventually hit trade lines coming in and out of the US. At the same time, for those diversions around the Cape of Africa, what happens is, big European ports like the port of Rotterdam. So in the next couple of weeks, because of the lack of traffic coming through the Mediterranean, those ports will start to dry up, right? There'll be no ships coming in, and then suddenly the wave will come through again, and so we'll create yet another backlog at some of those European ports. And again, that's now we're talking, 2 to 4 weeks time, and that's about as far as we're looking at right now, because we're hoping this all calms down very quickly. But on the off chance that it doesn't, we're going to see these impacts within the next month.
Pretty significant impacts. And something that I wrote down while you were talking that jumped out to me is that war tax. You said it could be up to 50%. Who's paying for that? Is that a price that's going to get passed on to the consumer?
Unfortunately, and before we talked about tariffs, and we discussed who really ends up paying for those. Yes, of course, this will come. This will absolutely be passed on eventually to the consumer, because it's going to increase the cost of goods shipping globally. So even though this is, this is all centered around the current conflict in the Middle East, because we work in a global supply chain, because we work in global networks, the costs have to be spread. And so while there may be no direct impact immediately to container shipping from Southeast Asia into the west coast of the United States, there's still going to be some element of price increase, because these costs have to be spread across the entire supply chain.
What we've seen right now when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, it has been described as a crisis, and President Trump weighed in on Truth Social. He provided some solutions, and I want to read them. He said that the Navy would accompany tankers through the strait if necessary, and he also said this. He ordered a U.S. government agency to provide all shipping lines, quote, political risk insurance and guarantees for the financial security of all maritime trade, especially energy traveling through the Gulf. And he ensured that that would be at a reasonable price, that insurance. What are your thoughts on those workarounds?
I think they're interesting. I think, Wall Street this morning has reacted favorably in terms of, okay, this is, oversight by the U.S. government. But, in real terms, there was a ship attacked again this morning, just outside the Straits of Hormuz, and the crew were forced to abandon. So I think that, these are significant stretches of water. It's a very complex problem. And ultimately, it will depend on how quickly, or the sustained impact of the conflict and what happens next. I mean, the Iranians have threatened, and they are seemingly today, over the last couple of days, they've been carrying out those threats. And that's a terrible thing for everybody involved, but in particular, the supply chain will continue to feel those reverberations. And we're not really good yet as supply chain practitioners at absorbing impacts. We're not really, the resilient supply chains that we've talked about for so long, we haven't really managed to get them fully working the way that we want them. And so whenever something like this happens, call it a black swan event or a gray swan event, it still impacts the global supply chain, and it will take us some time to recover.
You and I spoke about tariffs, and these are two completely different stories, right? But one thing that is similar is the uncertainty, right? And we talked about this before in this conversation, that there's really no deadline. There's seemingly no end in sight. President Trump said a couple of weeks, but there's no way to know how firm that deadline is. So how are companies preparing? Are they taking President Trump's word that it's 4 to 5 weeks and could be shorter? Are they preparing for longer than that? What does that really look like?
So again, in a lot of the different companies that I've spoken to this week, there is an element of crisis mode, and what's super important in the short term is securing capacity. So the other thing that we haven't mentioned yet are the airlines. So with Dubai in particular being a global hub, not just for passengers, transiting between Europe and Asia Pacific, but also for cargo, that's caused another problem. Also, the routing of airlines coming from China and Southeast Asia, again heading to Europe, that Middle Eastern corridor was the favored route, and so now planes are having to divert, again burning more fuel. The cost of fuel has just gone up this week, so this is all adding. And then whenever you take, the news today was that again there was something in the region of 11,000 flights cancelled around the world due to the conflict in the Middle East. So that's 11,000 planes that haven't, taken off and reached destination. A lot of supply chains leverage what we call that belly freight, that cargo space within those commercial flights. And so by taking that number of aircraft out of the supply chain, you're taking out that amount of capacity. That means that you're starting to see some constrained capacity on certain routes, which means an increase in price. So we're, across the board, we're starting to feel just these little pinches of, okay, we're seeing these different avenues, we're seeing these things starting to light up. And it's, the longer that it goes on, Brittany, then the longer the impact. And so what companies are doing is they're trying to secure that space. They're looking at those alternative routes. They're saying, we're not going to be able to ship, potentially, there's going to be a 21-day additional lead time. Maybe we should look at air cargo. Can we secure that air cargo space? And, there's another, again, a sort of a third element here, which is this time of year is incredibly important for procurement and planning for holiday season. So while you may think that, Christmas is a long way off and Black Friday is a long way off, a lot of the planning around manufacturing to build those finished goods, especially in things like consumer electronics, it's happening right now to have those products ready for shipment into the United States in September, October of this year. This particular impact is coming at probably the worst possible time, because right now that is when all of that planning and purchasing is actually happening.
So this, you're saying, could impact people's Christmases. They're seeing impacts at the pump right now. I want to talk about more of what people will see, because President Trump, he acknowledged these rising prices, right? And he said that we would have high oil prices for a little while, but as soon as the conflict ends, he predicted that these prices are going to drop lower than before. Is that something that you foresee happening?
Again, I can't speculate on oil prices. I look at it and say, based in, I'm based up in the Pacific Northwest. Across the board, there's been petrol pump increases this week, to the tune of 13, 14 cents a gallon. And that is all, to some extent speculative in terms of how badly the global supply has been impacted. So, the ebbs and flows of the commodities are interesting. The conflict for certain has, oil prices went up 7% on Monday. And since then, they've seemed to be a little bit stable. They dropped a little bit this morning, but depending on the next news cycle, depending on the next event, it's very difficult to say how this will go. And the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, in particular, they have warned that they're going to be pulling back on some capacity, and then OPEC have to decide what that means. So there's a much bigger set of decisions and discussions that have to happen here. But ultimately, there's going to be increased pressure in the short term. Hopefully, that will ease in the medium to long term.
What do you think then is missing from this conversation when we're talking about just the major shipping disruptions, when we're talking about the economic impacts and everything in between? What do you think's missing?
I mean, I think that it's very easy to not appreciate just how fragile the global supply chains remain. A lot of my conversations this week have been, okay, we can't always prepare for these things happening. It's very difficult to predict exactly when these global events could kick off and their longevity and what the true impact is. However, it just seems like a continual cycle from a supply chain perspective of one massive event after another. And it's if it's not this type of terrible global event, then it's a port strike, or it's a ship stuck in a Suez Canal, or it is a pandemic. It just feels like, wow, from a supply chain perspective, we're just dealing with one thing after another, and we still haven't got to a good place. We have to start thinking in a different way in terms of, a resilient supply chain traditionally is designed to absorb a shock. But absorbing a shock is no longer good enough. We have to start to embrace this volatility and think about how do we start to tear our supply chains apart a little bit? How do we leverage technology to get rid of some of this fragility, because it's really hurting?
To that point, I mean, we've seen a pandemic, we've seen a tanker stuck in the Suez Canal, we've seen tariffs, we've seen now this conflict in the Middle East. Do you think uncertainty then is the status quo?
Yes, absolutely. So uncertainty is the status quo, and we need to stop. We need to stop. Yelling and shouting whenever there's the next disruption, and we need to be prepared for it, and we need to be able to manage it and continue on. And if you think just over the last couple of years, even the Baltimore Bridge, there's just this list of ongoing issues which have all seemed to impact supply chain and caused a price increase, and which ultimately gets passed on to the consumer. At some point, as supply chain practitioners, we have to take a little bit of ownership for this and say, how can we make this better? How do we leverage the great technology that we have available to us to really start thinking about this in a different way and driving improvement?
And to that point about the consumer, if the only solution is to pass that price off, what choice are they left with? Is it either, I'm not buying X, Y, or Z, or that's too bad, I'm just stuck with this higher price? I mean, what does that really look like for the consumer?
I mean, the consumer ends up suffering a lot, and so the companies who are very smart around managing these risks, and the companies who are able to really absorb some of that cost pressure and think consumer first, they will ultimately win. And and you can see a little bit of this. You can see a little bit of this in terms of how the different brands have reacted and some of the things that they've done. But it also means that those brands are taking more risk. They are. Interestingly enough, when the Supreme Court ruled on tariffs a couple of weeks ago, it sort of was that news cycle was really interesting, because a lot of companies had actually imported goods into the US. They were holding them in bonded warehouses, waiting to see what would happen with the tariffs. And then when the tariffs were repealed by the Supreme Court, it was like, okay, now those products can move. And so it filled up the supply chain and then caused a little bit of a surge in demand on the freight side of the business. So these are continually moving pieces, Brittany, and as supply chain practitioners, we are doing our best to manage all of these different pieces. Consumers will feel the brunt, but also, I don't want to be negative here. I think that the supply chain community, we have some of the toughest jobs in the world. We run the world's trade. We make sure that everything moves as it should. And we are incredibly focused in doing that in a better way. We're incredibly focused in terms of actually leaning in, leveraging technology, becoming more predictable, and ultimately helping the consumer have the right product at the right price, in the right place at the right time. And that's complex, and it's getting more complex, because not only does the consumer change and their behaviors change, but we're continually faced with these massive disruptions in the supply chain, which just make our lives a little bit more challenging.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for. And as we see this crisis develop, and hopefully as there becomes more clarity, I hope you can come back on and break down where we're at. David Warrick, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Brittany, and thank you so much.